Well, it's a great pleasure to introduce Judith. Of course, since this is an internal webinar, Judith really needs no introduction, but I'm going to do so anyway, which is that Judith, of course, is a member of the Wilberforce Institute, where she's particularly interested in the historical slavery. Judith is an expert in British economic and social history of the early modern period, has worked and continues to work on such things as women, credit, death, those sorts of things, and has moved in the last 10 years to look at slavery in particular. She's in the middle of an extremely ambitious project, and this paper today is part of this, which is about talking about the intellectual and economic foundations of slavery over the very long durée. So it's a very ambitious and much needed and very exciting project. So I'll turn it over to you, Judith. If there are problems, please send a note to some of the organisers, and we'll try and see if we can fix those problems. And if you can, if you have questions, please type those, and Nick will provide those to me later on. Judith, over to you.
Thank you, Trevor. This is, as Trevor says, part of a very ambitious project that looks at slavery from an imagined beginning until abolition in the 19th century. I've been working on ideas about debt and slavery for a long time. When I began in 2007, I was concerned mostly with debt in monetary form, but over time, as I read more broadly, I came to believe that the concept of debt, that is the idea of being in debt, of owing something, is of key importance in understanding how historical communities justified the use of enslavement, that is, how it became institutionalised in custom and law. Now, if this is the case, then slavery is no different from any other social activity. All social interaction is informed by the boundaries we set on cooperative obligation. What we agree is acceptable social behaviour. The concept of debt is found in formal as well as informal agreements and practices, and these lie not just at the core of custom and law, but of community more generally. Now, if this is the case, then slavery is no different from any other social activity. All social interaction is informed by the boundaries we set on cooperative obligation. What we agree is acceptable social behaviour. The concept of debt or obligation is found in informal as well as formal agreements and practices, and these lie not just at the core of custom and law, but of community more generally. As the institution of slavery grew and developed through history and was incorporated into formal legal codes, it became associated with the aims and objectives of the law-making state, for whom it could become a tool of oppression. Now, in this paper, I want to suggest that the justifications that supported the creation of the first slave were part of the cooperative framework of early human societies. Now, this doesn't make it any less coercive, but does lend support to the idea that the institution of slavery emerged from a shared set of social beliefs. Despite its prevalence, researchers revealed that the nature of slavery and the experience of the enslaved varied considerably across time and space. And as a result, historians especially are reluctant to consider any overarching explanations. So my approach has been to examine this from a different direction, looking not at the nature of slavery or at the experience of the enslaved, but at the process of enslavement itself. Now, this doesn't answer the question of why there was a demand for slavery. And though widespread, the institution was not ubiquitous, but it does help explain how it was made acceptable. The process of enslavement has little variation. If we consider the routes that were used to reduce individuals to slavery, we find birth to an enslaved parent or parents, capture in warfare, punishment for a crime, sale for debt, or by a member of the family, and some form of voluntary enslavement or self-sale. And most of these we can see were linked to some form of poverty or destitution. Now, the abduction and sale of free individuals also resulted in enslavement unless those who were captured were redeemed. This route was never sanctioned as part of the institution of slavery, however. In most societies, it was prescribed in law and often carried a significant punishment. Now, in the talk today, I'm only concerned with the sanctioned or legitimate routes into slavery. These roots didn't emerge at the same time nor exist in parallel in every society that sanctioned enslavement. But looking at them together suggests not only that they were informed by the idea of a debt, but by a very specific form of debt, what I'm calling a life debt. This is sometimes stipulated, but more often recovered from the context. People entered slavery in circumstances in which their survival was perceived to be at risk. The act of enslavement prevented their death, but there was a price to be paid, a debt owing. Their lives were transferred into the possession of someone else in exchange. So thus at the heart of enslavement lie the three concepts that form the title for this talk: debt, death, and possession. The question is then, how did this come about? Well, if we're prepared to be sufficiently reductionist, we could argue that these three concepts lie at the heart of all social activity. Yet today there is no secular law that supports enslavement for the purposes of survival. So how did it come to be justified in relation to debt, death, and possession in the past? To understand this, I felt that we needed to consider the context in which slavery first emerged. So in this talk, I draw on a number of sources, I suppose, really. I draw on models of human social behaviour, on some historical documents, some anthropology, and even I've consulted some early primate studies to think about how slavery might have emerged in the earliest human groups. What I found is that the key to understanding this is the family. And I'm loosely defining this here as a collection of individuals descended from a common ancestor who cooperated over resources and protection as a survival mechanism and identified as a group. And it's not difficult to see ideas of debt, death, and possession at work in the earliest families. Indeed, in some tribal and ancient societies, women and children can look very similar to those who were enslaved. So David Davis noted in the 1960s that there were three characteristics that are usually cited as evidence of slavery: belonging to another person, being subject to that person, and being forced to labour. But all these things can apply just as easily to wives and children. The possession of wives and children did not make them slaves, but it may have provided a way to think about slavery. In the 1980s, Gerda Lerner claimed that men learned how to enslave from their experience in subjugating women, although she gave no clear explanation about how freedom did tip over into slavery. So this talk provides a way to think about that. It suggests that the idea of being part of a family gave early humans a way to think about who did and who did not belong, and those who did not belong could become slaves. Now, I've broken down the talk into 4 sections, and that doesn't seem to, there we are. Thinking about slavery in prehistory, death, debt, and possession in the historiography, cooperative behaviour, the cognitive revolution, and the family, and I'll conclude with some discussion about the family and enslavement. If we think first about how we might think about slavery in prehistory, slavery appears in some of the oldest historical documents from the 4th and 3rd millennium BCE. So it was already in place by the time historical records begin. For the period beforehand, we have only archaeology to tell us about human behaviour, and that provides nothing concrete about enslavement. So as a result, scholars interested in such behaviour turn to contemporary models of social interaction and tend to extrapolate back in time. I've used the latest models of cooperative behaviour which place reciprocal exchange as a survival strategy at the heart of human social interaction. These models are based on the idea of cooperation, that as individuals we develop strategies with others for our mutual benefit. That benefit may not be equally distributed, but improves the outcome for both parties. Now, these cooperative models shift the focus from the old battle, if you like, between the self-interested individualist Homo economicus and the culturally determined Homo sociologicus at the top there, the product of structural functionalism. Instead, what we have is the Homo ludens, the game-playing humans, and the Homo reciprocans, the reciprocal humans, who participate in a series of exchanges that are designed to improve their own outcomes within an agreed social setting. We can tie this straight away to slavery because if we look at Orlando Pattison's work, he argued that for enslavement to gain community sanction, it required a level of individual acquiescence and group authorization. So first there had to be a psychological element. Those who were enslaved had to recognize it was in their benefit to submit to control. Second, there had to be a socio-cultural element. The community had to authorize the practice of enslavement so that they could transform force into right. Now, Pattison's model was not about cooperation, but alienation, the use of symbolic instruments and ritualistic practices to coerce the enslaved into accepting the control of their masters. Now, this cooperative model does not challenge Pattison's claims about social control. Debt is in itself a very powerful coercive mechanism when it comes to managing human behaviour. But it places it within a broader set of social strategies informed by the most powerful of human objectives, the desire to survive. Because the game that Homo Ludens talks about, the game that early humans and arguably all of us have been most closely engaged in, has been that of survival. So I'll turn now to the second part to look at death, debt and possession in the historiography. In the early 20th century, Elwerhead argued that slavery beneath its diverse forms is only in the final analysis a substitution for actual death, the principal function of slavery being the preservation of man. Elwerhead knew he was not breaking new ground at this time. The link between slavery and the escape from death had been made explicit over 14 centuries earlier in Roman law. This is the view of the jurist Florentinus that we found in the Digest, and it was repeated in the following centuries over and over again. Slaves, called servae in Latin, are so called because generals usually sell their war prisoners, thereby saving them rather than killing them. More recent scholars, such as Templey, have challenged the reality of this exchange. Templey was keen to claim, for example, to undermine the very idea that self-preservation was an admissible defence of slavery, claiming that as with most defences, we shouldn't believe that those who used such arguments took them to be literally true. At the same time, as noted above, the routes by which individuals become enslaved can be linked to the idea of survival, and by implication, at least, the enslaved were understood to owe their lives to others because of some act of saving them. That was the justification. Pattison recognised this. He thought that the most distinctive attribute of the slave's powerlessness was that it always originated, or was conceived of having originated, as a substitute for death. In other words, authority over the life of the enslaved was granted on the basis of survival. He made an important point, though, that slavery didn't erase the prospect of death. Instead, it signalled that the master had bought or acquired the life of the slave. So this meant that the master also had the right to bring that life to an end. In Andrew Feed's recent book, Homicide Justified, he opens his book with the story of John Hoover of North Carolina, who, when arrested in March 1839 for killing his slave Myra, argued that it was because she was his Negro and his property, that he had the right to do with her whatever he pleased. Authority meant possession to him. And the idea that the enslaved were first and foremost items of property has been a key way to identify them in the past. Though challenged by Pattison in the 1980s and brought under further scrutiny by the emergence of contemporary slavery, there are still many scholars who use the property definition as the primary way of identifying the enslaved. But doing so throws up a problem for the history of slavery. The enslaved were not alone in being the object of a property relation. As I mentioned earlier, women and children were also held as dependent possessions, and I've just got two examples of that from the past. The first comes from ancient Sumeria, and it relates to the clerk's listing of an inventory of a borrower, if you like, who was borrowing, as I put on the left side, 49 core of barley. The clerk sets against that against his liabilities, his assets, which were, in terms of his possessions, a house, 2 bedrooms, 5 chairs, can't see that because it's got 2 millstones. It's hidden by my webinar thing. Sorry about that. 2 millstones, a wife, 3 daughters, and a mortar, all of which could be sold if he didn't repay the debt. The other one is a set of ideas that comes from the ancient Indian epics, where there were 3 groups of people who were identified as having no right to property because they were themselves objects of property. And those objects were the wife, the son, and the slave. They were, everything that they possessed effectively belonged to those who owned them. So we have a question: if the lives of women and children are held as possessions in the same way as those of the enslaved, how are they to be thought of as different? Section 3, to look at cooperative behaviour, the cognitive revolution, and the family for some answers to this. Now, it's clear that the family had an important role in relation to enslavement. Smaller kin-based societies in Africa and the Americas had 2 levels of integration for the women and children they seized from neighbouring communities. In some cases, this involved a process of assimilation, in which women and children who were captured were adopted into families as wives and stepchildren, and became fully fledged members of the community. In others, those who were captured remained outside the family and were reduced to slavery. In the absence of the lawmaking state, it was the family that determined who and who would not be enslaved. So how was that done? Now, to consider this, I'm going to take you back to the earliest point at which slavery could have been possible. And this is the cognitive revolution. Now, the so-called cognitive revolution that I'm talking about here was the point at which humans developed the capacity for high-level abstract thought. Most commentators agree that it had become generalized across human populations by around 40,000 years ago. We're the only species to engage in high-level abstract thought. The brain size increased significantly, we can see in the archaeological record, and much of that increase was in the prefrontal cortex, the bit behind the forehead, which houses decision-making and future planning. And I hope you'll see where this is important. In terms of high-level abstract thought, this involves the human brain effectively talking to itself. And this means we can identify and visualize objects and actions that are not part of our immediate experience. In other words, we can imagine. Now, this allowed us to develop complex systems of communication, including language, with which we could extend and develop our social behavior. But the capacity to imagine allowed us to do much more than that. It allowed us to construct our social environment in ways that had not been possible before. We were able to think beyond ourselves as individuals to the social. We were able to envisage a future that was different from the past. And we were able to create the strategies and the context whereby we could fulfill those desires. And this had immense significance for our social and individual selves. For every action we undertook, we developed a figurative counterpart, a representation of itself in our brains. But it wasn't just that. Once we had that representation, that imagination, we could not only think independently about what we were doing, but why we were doing it and how we could make it socially acceptable. I want to relate that now, in having discussed that, relate that to the very early family. There's good reason to believe from archaeology, anthropology, and contemporary primate studies that humans would have lived together in cooperative groups of children, parents, and possibly consanguine adults, brothers and sisters of the parents, before the development of high-level abstract thought. And within these groups, there was cooperation over food production, the provision of protection, because this adaptation improved the chances of survival. So now I want to relate these 3 concepts of death, debt, and possession to those activities that humans were doing before they developed abstract thought. First, we have to think about the group itself. Group living gives rise to the idea of the family, because the idea of the family comes to represent those for whom food and security is being provided. But this sets up an important distinction between entitled insiders and predatory outsiders who were to be kept apart from the family. we think about the provision of food and security, the individual actions of doing that gave rise to the idea of possession. Who is providing the food and protection, and for whom, and who is benefiting? Actions become understood as productive of certain goods and services which belong to the producer, and strategies are introduced to reflect this. We know that proprietorship is visible at lower levels of cognitive development. It's evidenced in young children and some primates, as well as other animal species where it's linked to territorial behaviour. Now, without any social and institutional means of controlling those possessions, the groups that have them have to protect them, and usually by force. But what happens if we introduce the concept of debt? The practice of sharing possessions then can give rise to this idea of debt. The idea of debt allows reciprocal exchange, those things that we share with other people, to be calculated and weighed in the balance. It allows for the idea of return, giving individuals a claim on the possessions of others that will offset their loss or compensate them for their actions. It conceives of equal and unequal exchange and can carry forward into the future as well. So the idea of debt becomes very powerful because it has forward and backward linkages, as well as requiring others to provide something in return for what they obtain from us. We can give things to people in the expectation that that we can demand something from them in the future. We can have a moral claim to it. And the argument is that if you think about that as a social strategy, it's a very powerful one for keeping people together and arguing that they can demand and give things to each other over a long period of time. When we come to death, it's slightly different. Death emerges from the ability to generalize experience. And the benefits of reasoning and learning that came with higher level abstract thought have to be weighed against its significant psychological cost. Because though many species live in groups in order to increase their survival chances, only with the emergence of that high level abstract thought were we able to recognize the real irony of all that activity, because at some point in the future, we would die. This discovery appears to have instigated a search for explanation that we found beyond ourselves. We placed ultimate responsibility for our survival in the cosmological and in the supernatural. And in the records of ancient Near Eastern religions and in many other religions, we can see the consequences of that. In the practice of sacrifice, we sought to offer gods a quota of life in exchange for some extension of our own or some protection of our own. And we accepted the authority of divinities, believing that only by following their commands would we be saved from dying. And I've just got one example here to show you, which is from the Hebrew Bible, Deuteronomy. And it reflects the belief that if you do what the Lord commands, then he will keep you alive. So together, Homo ludens and Homo reciprocans sought to devise ways in which they could avoid or at least delay death. I want to apply the idea that we submit ourselves to the authority of those to provide for our survival by making an analogy with the family. Evidence for a shift to a carnivorous diet exists from well before the cognitive revolution, and the biological pressures of child rearing suggest that men would have done the bulk of hunting for the animals and also for fighting to protect their communities. Evidence of authority in early non-literate communities is difficult to recover, and there's considerable debate about levels of egalitarianism in nomadic and semi-sedentary societies. But there are modern examples that link the ideas of provisioning and security to authority. And I'll just give a couple of these. In his early 20th century study of slavery, for example, Nearboer reviewed some of the first studies of the Aboriginal community in the southeast of Australia, the Gunai community. And he reported that among them, the man must hunt for the sustenance of his wife and children and fight for their protection. The responsibility of the safety of his wife and children is incumbent on him. Now, he also noted in that study that Gunai wives were understood to belong to their husbands, and as widows could be transferred into the ownership of their husband's brothers if necessary. Another example comes from the beginning of this century in a survey of human social evolution by Leighton, an anthropologist. He argued that the contribution of the father or mother to the survival of the family was an important determinant of whether the family lineage was matrilineal or patrilineal. Now, matrilineity and patrilineity are not the same as matriarchy and patriarchy. I accept that. But the pattern of descent does hint at the justifications for social authority in the idea of survival. And I've got one more example from ancient history in the Code of Hammurabi from about 1780 BCE. In that, Babylonian fathers had possession of their children until they married. They had a right to their labour in return for their subsistence. They could hire them out, receive their wages, pledge them for debt, and could even sell them outright if necessary. What's interesting is that mothers enjoyed the same rights of authority over their offspring as fathers did in the absence of the father. And if the mother and father died, then that right could be passed to elder brothers who took on the role of parents. So the evidence is scattered and problematic, but there is some support, I would argue, for the view that the fear of death gave authority over dependence to those who protected them and supplied their needs. This was not slavery, however. Wives and children may have been understood as possessions in the legal systems of the ancient Near East, but they were also recognized as heirs to family assets rather than objects of inheritance, because the purpose of the family was to assist in the survival of its members in the long as well as the short term through the sharing of resources and the transmission of goods where possible to the next generation. There was no process for a man to become the master of his free wife or a father to become the master of his free children. So, to conclude, the family and enslavement. Learner suggested that the process of enslavement was at first developed and perfected on female war captives. Because women were already treated as possessions, it was easy to apply the same approach to female war captives. And there is some consensus across the historiography that the first individuals to have been enslaved were likely to have been women. David Davies, for example, argued that the sign for slave girl appeared before the word for slave. We also know that women and children were more likely to be kept as war captives. But how might the model of subjection of family members be adapted for those outside of it? Well, in my interpretation, authority arose out of the imagined obligation that individuals owed to those who could lay claim to provide for their survival. For family members, this did not lead to enslavement because the chief goal of the family was to provide for the survival of those members. However, the same model, when applied to the obligation of non-family members, had to result in a different outcome. And for this, an alternative abstraction was necessary, one that would differentiate the non-member from the member, and this took the form of the slave. The distinction came to rest on the extent of the debt. Anyone brought into the group, into the family, who was not incorporated as a fully fledged member of the family, could survive only at a cost to that family by eating and taking up its resources. Could be imagined in this way. But this was a result, of course, as I said, of giving access to resources that belonged to the family. And importantly, there was no prior entitlement for those people to have those goods of the family. So in exchange, their lives were to be held as possessions within the family for as long as they continued to live, unlike wives and children, whose dependent status was effectively a function of their family roles. There's one further aspect of the possession of the outsider that sealed the mental concept of the slave in the shared consciousness of the society. Once incorporated into the workings of the family as a possession, the outsider became a valuable asset. And as such, it was important that he or she could be transferred intact to the next generation. It was this decision that was critical to the consolidation of the idea of the slave status. The outsider was no longer simply a possession, but a possession that was transferable in perpetuity. So, slavery was not an exchange of death for life, but an exchange of life for life. Perceived through a social lens which weighed activities in the balance, the enslaved, like other dependents, found their lives held in the possession of others on account of their survival. But because they were not family members and had no entitlement to family resources, the nature of their debt was different. The construction of their lives as possessions within the family was permanent. So with the recognition that these lives could be devised and exchanged, the institution of slavery had begun. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judith. That's an awful lot of things to talk with. So what we encourage people to do now is to present questions if they have any. I've put a few, and Nick may have some questions that he wants to put forward that everyone can discuss. I've got a few questions from me, which I'll perhaps start off with while people are thinking about what they're doing. The first one, Judith, is that statement you got with Deuteronomy 6:24-5. It seems very Hobbesian to me. Is your account compatible with Hobbes's idea of Leviathan, which I guess I could combine with thinking about James Scott's ideas about how the invention of the state was probably a bad thing for the majority of people. Where does Leviathan, where does the state fit into your idea about the origins of slavery?
Yes, it's a good question, Trevor. Thank you. In terms of the state, what in my sort of longer overview of slavery that I talk about, the state actually comes to, as I've talked about here, it's the family originally that makes the decision over whether people can be enslaved or not, and that's largely dependent on whether they see them as outsiders or not, and the role that they can take in that respect. What the state does is begin to take over the decisions that are made about who and who cannot be enslaved. But actually what that does is that it begins to reduce the conditions under which people can become enslaved. So gradually what the state does is that it starts to pull away at some of those rules, if you like, or agreements that the customary agreements that the family made, in order to make to offer some protections to some groups rather than others. And that, I think, is where you see changes in the way that slavery is applied to certain groups or not, as the case may be.
Okay, great, thanks. A question from Nick. Did societies you were describing use language to recognize they were part of a family? How was this denoted? Dwelling, words, language?
So yeah, so how am I defining the family?
Well, sorry, in what way is language used to recognize how societies recognize people as being part of a family, and how is this denoted?
I mean, in a sense, that's why I use that very loose definition of slavery, of the family at the beginning, because societies have very different ways of conceptualizing what a family is. You know, nuclear family and the extended family are probably the ones that are most often used and thought about. But the idea of the family itself can be used as a metaphor, and is used as a metaphor throughout the history of slavery, to suggest that certain groups will protect others. So the Christians describe themselves as a family, as a group, and within that they try then to offer protections to all those who fit within their family. So the family is used in all sorts of different ways and through a number of linguistic forms to offer protection to people. So I wouldn't like to say that I have a particular view of what which particular terms are used or in one context they're used. It's wherever you can identify a notion of a group that identifies itself as being cohesive and thinks of itself as having some sort of common ideas. I know it's not very clear, Nick, sorry, but it's a really big problem in terms of looking at slavery. The more you look into these issues, the more rabbit holes of language you disappear into, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, a couple of follow-up questions from Nick. Did the family recognize they were part of a family? And you mentioned group living provided a growing sense of family. So when did the enslaved begin to live remotely from their owner?
I don't think they did. I don't think they did. I think the idea of the family originally comes from some sort of bloodline, some sort of common ancestry, and that's how originally it would have been understood. And that's certainly how I see it as we get into the historical records. People look at it through a biological sort of bloodline, if you like, and how that works. Where it's located. Sorry, what's the other part, Trevor?
It was, you mentioned group living provided, this is Nick, you mentioned group living provided a growing sense of family. So when did the enslaved begin to live remotely from their owner?
Well,
a spatial question.
Well, a spatial question. Well, it depends. There are many cases in which they live separately from their family at a very early point in Germany. That's in the Roman records. Other than that, I think there are cases in which you can find slaves living remotely from families at various different places and points in time. So there isn't a specific time in which I can lay that down, I'm afraid. Sorry, Nick. And what was the other part of his question, Trevor? Sorry.
When did the enslaved begin to live remotely from their owner?
Yeah, no, that was the first part. Before that, there was something else.
You mentioned group living provided a growing sense of family.
Yes, in terms of a sense of family, there would have been ways to identify who the family was, and some of the earliest records from Greece and Roman society suggest that there were rituals involved in introducing people into the family, so that was the way in which the family was identified, through whoever had gone through the necessary rituals or naming practices to become part of the family.
Okay, Nick, do we have any other questions from outside viewers? Outside questions? Well, I'll ask while they're coming. I just ask a question from myself, Judith. You discuss the family in respect of entitled insiders and predatory outsiders. And I just wonder, is predatory really the right word? Are not outsiders very vulnerable people as family dynamics solidify?
Yeah, no, I'll take that one, Trevor. That was I thought about that actually today as I was reading through it, and you're right. There are two forms actually of outsiders, but I think the point that I was trying to make was that however you look at them, outsiders, whether they're predatory or whether they're asking for help, are coming to make claim on your resources. So I suppose that's how I'm thinking about it.
Okay. We do have some unanswered questions from John and David, but I don't know quite what those are. Nick, what are they? What are the questions? Can you? Do we know how to get the John and David's questions, Nick, or Judith, or Maria?
I'm just having a look.
Well, while we figure that out, I have another question, I guess, from here, which would be that can you describe who do you want to really challenge? Is it Orlando Patterson and his views? Is it that you stress cooperation than alienation? And what's at stake between your argument and, say, Patterson's, if Patterson is a person that you're wanting to go against?
I don't think I want to necessarily go. Yeah, I go against. I think probably is the wrong thing. Patterson is the I suppose the most well known and largely the only significant theory of slavery over, I don't know, over the last sort of when was it, 1986 that he wrote it. There hasn't really been anything significant since then. There has been some nibbling around the edges, and there's been an interesting discussion of his idea about property recently in the volume on human bondage that went to review what he'd done. But a lot of the alienation hasn't changed. I think what I wanted to do overall was challenge some of the history that sees enslavement or slavery as having no shared social characteristics. And so I don't think there's any one person that looks at that. I think there are a range of people. And Patterson, in a way, is looking at social control. So he's interested in similar issues, but he is coming at it from a different perspective. He's coming at it from the alienation of the slave, and I suppose I'm coming at it from within the society in which the level of alienation is decided or not by the family. And it's just a slightly different perspective, because I want to think, rather than what society is doing to the slave, to think about what we as a society did to justify enslavement. Does that make sense?
Makes sense, yeah. A question from John. Can debt be calibrated in such a way that it can be paid off? He's interested in the idea of hereditary lifetime servitude and where this comes from. So where can debt be calibrated in such a way it can be paid off, and where does hereditary lifetime servitude come from?
It comes from the transfer of the life of the life of the person through the generations. So effectively, it becomes a permanent exchange in a way. There are a number of ways in which debt is calibrated, and that depends, of course, on the power structures in which the debt is observed or is noted. So it changes over time. And part of the interesting thing about slavery is that, because debt is a social construction, the way that it's calibrated does change over time. And part of the rest of the book that I'm writing includes some discussion of the extent to which that debt is understood, reworked, rethought out. But in the way that I'm thinking about it at the moment, the idea of the hereditary bondage, if you like, comes from the fact that the person who is being saved, if you like, or survived, has a permanent debt, that the only way you can actually counter that is to pay off that debt by doing something else. So usually that relates to manumission. I haven't talked about manumission, but there is an idea that if you can create some sort of comparative life experience that you can weigh against that, then you can actually escape. And what that usually appears as in the ancient records is that if a slave, for example, saved his master's life, then he could become free. That was written into a lot of legal codes. And that is if you like, that's the payoff. So you effectively sort of exchanged your life, you've reclaimed it or rebought it in some way, and therefore yours can be released.
David has a question. What does your analysis suggest about the relationship of violence and war to enslavement? In what sense does he mean relationship? So does that is violence and war something that is undertaken personally for just for enslavement? If that's what he means, is war undertaken for the purposes of enslavement? Then yes, it is. But that goes back to sort of my early comment in the talk, that looking at enslavement really doesn't take us to the reasons why people demanded slaves and wanted slaves. That's slightly different. It only takes us to the justifications that people used. And one of the reasons that's always included is war, and that's largely because of that comment from in the digest about captives being saved, if you like, by not being killed. But there is a generalized understanding that that is the case, even in societies where there is no written law in that sense. There's some understanding that if you let people live, they become yours in that way. I don't really know about violence itself. I have to think about a bit more about that. I'm not quite sure what David means by that. David, do you want to Do you want to expand on what you're doing? You're saying?
Can you hear me?
I
Yes,
can hear you. Yes, David. Hello. Nice to talk to you.
Yes, good. What I had in mind is that I'm thinking really of someone like Locke, who was the last, if you like, philosopher in England, at least, to look to find some form of justification in slavery. But Locke very much circumscribed it, and he talked about, for example, that yes, someone could fall a slave in what he would call a just war, but wars of conquest were not something that he would recognize as justifying slavery. And so someone who was defending themselves or their family against an aggressor, if they managed to defeat the aggressor, they could legitimately enslave the aggressor. And in that sense, then they had, having defeated the aggressor, they could, for example, obviously kill the aggressor, or they could save the aggressor. And in a sense, there's a nice little phrase, actually, believe it or not, in Tolkien, where he talks about someone was in debt to the mercy of their of the person that they'd offended, if you like, or okay. And that always, this notion of mercy, I think, is an interesting one too. But I'm just wondering, when I asked the question about the distinction between just war and war of conquest, which of course was a very live issue in Locke's time, because of course that there was the aggression of the Europeans, and then the colonization, and indeed the attempt to enslave the indigenous population. That's what I was really getting at. And of course, many of us think about violence as one of the defining features of slavery. And therefore, if it's a defining feature of it, you'd expect it to be implicit in the process of slavery and how it develops. That's all. There's another question I'll send.
Yeah, no, I didn't realise that you had Locke in mind, and I see where you were going with that now. Locke's an interesting case because he really is on the cusp of change. I've been working through, and this will, I'll not say very much about it because it's the chapter I'm writing up at the moment. But what is interesting about Locke is that he sits within an understanding of slavery, and he places slavery largely outside the state, as far as I understand it, so that it is not part of what the state legitimately allows. We can talk about this maybe at another occasion, but that's important because from the introduction of the new word slave in the medieval period, that term has a meaning that is very closely linked to violence and illegitimacy because of the medieval slave trade. And that works right through up to Locke. So when Locke is using the term slave and slavery, he is imagining a violent and illegal act in many ways that works outside the state. So he's quite difficult to put into a more legitimate framework of slavery, and so I'll leave it there, I think, if that's all right.
Yeah, that's fine. I totally agree. I mean, Locke is seen, as I said earlier, one of the last of the English philosophers, at least, to contemplate the possibility that slavery could exist, although contrary to some people who think, he was legitimizing slavery, I don't think he was really doing that. He was imagining a world in which the other thing, of course, and David Davis picked this up, is that Locke saw slavery as existing in a state of nature.
Yes, exactly.
rather than something that one could argue, of course, as indeed some philosophers do, that the world you're talking about, the very ancient, almost the prehistory world, is actually a world close to a state of nature. I posted another question that I'd just like, and if I may, just to follow up on this. What I've asked is, in this question, do you see any value in looking at human pawning, as for example in parts of pre-colonial Africa? Bearing in mind that many of those societies were pre-literate, in exploring the role of debt in the birth of slavery. And there's an issue there which goes back to the question John raised, which is that we do know peoples in Africa were quite prepared to pawn members of their family, or at least members perhaps who they'd already previously enslaved, but what they were doing is pawning people in order to gain credit. So a credit system based on human pawning arises. What is interesting, and this I think is a significant point, is if the pawn should decide to abscond, then the family would be expected to produce another pawn to maintain the debt. And there was also, how do you pay off your debt? How do you calibrate the payment of the debt and so on in a period of time? There's a lot in what I would call the studies of human pawnship in Africa, which may shed light on the issues that you're looking at, the relationship with the notion of debt. And in their case, they're talking about some notion of financial debt, whereas you're really advancing a notion of someone becoming enslaved because otherwise they will lose their life. So there's a different aspect of it, and I think that may. But I do think there may be some value in looking at human ownership arrangements in Africa, not least because they, in many cases, they're pre-literate societies. Some of the worlds that you're talking about are pre-literate. So how did they work these things out in a way which doesn't require any, at least, written contract? And I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you that pawning is a very important part of this, and you see the same types of pawning in the ancient societies. They are written, so they're not in a sense pre-literate, but it suggests that the idea of pawning was already in use by the time these records were created. So yes. It's all about the ability to use a resource, which is somebody's life effectively, or somebody's body, in a period in which they had very few other resources that they could offer, to set against the debt that they borrowed. So I thank you for that, David. I hadn't particularly thought about that in this context, but I think that considering why it is that some people are pawns and some are slaves, and the way that these debts are calculated over time and across space, I think is very important. Thank you.
Do we have any further questions? Perhaps any questions that people want to talk about verbally or as well as written? If you do have a verbal question, just unmute yourself and go ahead. Okay, well, I think Judith, that shows that you've if either convinced people or you've complicated the subject enough that we're all a bit we're all not quite sure what to think more further. But I think it's been an incredibly enriching seminar today. It's enriching in particular because you're taking on very big topics and dealing with some of the most crucial things in regard to the origins of slavery and the justifications for slavery. And we can see it gives a taster into what promises to be a really significant work, your large book on debt and enslavement over time. It is bold, which sounds like one of those yes, Prime Minister questions that you say when you think someone's doing something unwise. but I think that it's,
well, that's what I mean, Trevor. You know, which bold is one thing to say, but you can do better than that. Is this a good bold or a bad bold?
Well, I think we can definitely say it's a good bold. I think that's the case, and I think that it's particularly important. I mean, that the work of what we're doing at the Wilberforce Institute, it's always been very relevant, but it's hard to see it being much more relevant than it is at the present time, when we're seeing, to an extent that I've never seen in my lifetime, interest in historical slavery, the origins of slavery, racism, all those sorts of things. In this country and other countries, in ways that might be quite transformative. So Hilary Beckles was on BBC on World at One on Radio 4 today. Said that this might be he thinks this is a crucial moment in the changing of particularly in America, but elsewhere as well, the relationship of Black people to society. And so the more what we can do in terms of understanding not only that very large subject, but slavery over the very long durée, I think is really important. So hopefully everyone can join with me in thanking Judith for a terrific talk, and we'll be in touch with everyone to see what they thought about this particular way of doing things, and we'll have another webinar fairly soon. So thank you very much, Judith.